Thank you so much for having me. It's beautiful to see you all here. Before we get started, I just want to acknowledge that we are on unceded Aboriginal land. And for my next book, I've spent a lot of time in the Kimberley and in Perth talking to Indigenous matriarchs, elders. And one of those women is Arnie June Oscar. She's a Bunabur elder, former Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander woman. I was speaking to her on her traditional law ground near Fitzroy Crossing. And she said to me, we are never going to go forward as a country until we reconcile with the violence of our past. And she's talking about the thousands of Indigenous people who were slaughtered on this land and land all over this country. So in the context of what we're talking about today, I just want to acknowledge what that actually means, that we are on stolen land. In the lead up to the election, we heard a bit of stuff about, I don't want to be welcomed to my own country. Well, it's not your country. So we're honoured to be here today on unceded Indigenous land. And we are talking about violence today. So just wanted to put this discussion about the modern violence that we're discussing in the context of that broader story of our nation that we have not yet reconciled with. So today we're talking about, can we stop the violence? What a huge question. Hope you're ready. Just a gentle reminder, these are hard things that we're grappling with. We're talking about abuse, trauma, violence against women and children, violence against young boys. So if you need to walk out, take a breather, please go ahead. Now, this is basically my dream team on stage here. I know all these folks personally, Sonia, Jess and Shannon, and all of them are incredible writers. Their books are unput-downable in different ways, and they just have a way of drawing you into this narrative, even though it's hard. They're talking about these deeply personal issues, systematic abuse, the realities of trauma and the difficulties of the justice system. So I'm just overjoyed. I feel like I've been given the gift of a job today. They've each got these powerful and unique voices. So right at this moment in Australia, we are in the middle of a reckoning about gendered violence and a reckoning about our justice system. And also, as Shannon's book powerfully talks about, we're starting to think about violence against children in a different way, and particularly little boys. So Jess Hill, here on my right, award-winning journalist, author of See What You Made Me Do. She's written a couple of quarterly essays, and her latest one is talking about systematic failures when it comes to gendered violence and perhaps how some of the things that we assume will fix the problem may not. Sonia Orchard's book is called Groomed. I couldn't put Sonia's book down either. So she's a novelist, memoirist, and she's bringing a really nuanced lens to these issues, confronting the ripple effects of silence and what happens when you try to take your case to the justice system. And Shannon, journalist, author, his book is very powerful. It's You Made Me This Way. And he's confronting something in his own life which has had a silence around it for decades, and that is his own abuse as a child by another child. And he's telling us about male survivors. So thank you, all of you. This is going to be a hard conversation, but a passionate and personal one. And we are being recorded for Radio National's Big Ideas, so don't swear. I'll take some questions at the end, but for now I'm going to guide the discussion. So I've got a question for all of you to start out with. Each of your book is navigating this profound tension between personal trauma and systematic failure. And so I want to ask each of you in turn, how did you navigate the emotional and ethical burden of turning such intimate stories, your own and others, into these public narratives? It's a big responsibility. Sonia, do you want to start?
Sure. Thank you, Ginger, and thank you, everybody, for coming along. For me, my book is mostly memoir, so I didn't have a lot of other people's stories to think about too much, but where I did include other people, I they always got to see final drafts, and there was power of complete veto, which did happen, and I'm absolutely fine with that. The last thing you want to do to a survivor is take their story and kind of manhandle it in any way that they're not happy with. So with my story, there still is a huge emotional burden when you are telling your story. And, you know, I learnt that very, very early on. As soon as I started telling people about that I had gone to the police, I realised very, very quickly that I was having to then manage everyone's response, and I was having to kind of navigate their response, and I actually got sick of talking about it because of having to deal with how people responded to me. And I don't think we have learnt very well how to hold someone's story and let them just tell their story, which is just what I wanted to do. So there is an emotional burden in telling a story. There is also a huge emotional burden in not telling your story, and I don't think we talk about that a lot. And so, yes, it was hard going telling my story, but it was harder going not telling my story. And for me, there was a point where, you know, I had to, you know, I did the kind of the balance, and I thought, no, I'm going to tell my story. I think there's also... Oh, look, I'll leave that for the moment.
No, we will come back to how people respond, because
Yep.
I know everybody here, in response to the work they've done, gets people telling and disclosing. And you talk about that powerfully in the quarterly essay. Shannon, I'm just going to jump to you now, just off the back of what Sonia said about keeping the silence for decades, and how hard that is, but also the responsibility you feel in disclosing publicly your own story, but lots of other people's stories in your book.
Yeah, so my book it's my story, but also the stories of half a dozen other men. For context, I spoke to probably about a dozen while writing this book, and some never wanted to be part of the book, but wanted to tell their story to me, I guess for a deeper understanding. One pulled out at the last minute, which was totally fine. Everyone, like Sonia, everyone had total control over their story, how it was shared. And so I felt a huge responsibility to handle it with care, but also to keep the gravity of it, because it is one of the worst things that happens in society. What I was confronted with time and time again was the damage of silence. All of these men and myself, and that's the title of the book, You Made Me This Way, have been damaged by what happened to them as boys, but also the decades of silence that followed, that unresolved trauma, questioning yourself, loathing yourself, all the rest of it. And I think what encapsulates the how common silence is the fact that one of the men in the book, I was the very first person that he'd spoken to about it. He's in his 40s, it happened in his tween years, cusp of adolescence, and he had never spoken about it before. And I didn't realise that until we're on our second or third conversation. And that is quite remarkable to me, that you can live with something for the better part of 30 years and have it upend your life in such a dramatic way.
What made you live with it for so long? Because I read your first book, which was harrowing. Has anyone read 14? It's an incredible book that Shannon wrote, and it has been turned into a play. I read that, and that was sort of a freight train coming at me. It's a wonderful book, but it's hard. And when I read this one, I was like, holy cow, has this guy been through a lot? So why did it take you so long?
There were happy parts of my childhood too, let me just be clear. It's funny, it's something I thought I would never talk about. I was 5 when it happened, and I thought about it most days, if not every day after that. But I put it in a little box and buried it deep inside, like all good people of Irish Catholic stock do.
Yep.
And that worked for a while until it didn't. And I was very lucky to have the money to pay for a great shrink who started to chip away to find that buried box. And more I realised, oh, okay, that's why I am like this. That's why I'm like that. And so that was really powerful. And part of the process of figuring out why I am the way I am was meeting lots of other men and hearing their shockingly similar stories, not of what happened to them, but of where they ended up, drove home the importance of speaking. There's not many stories about child sexual abuse from a man's perspective, and that is just because men tend not to speak about it ever, or very, very late. And it's also just generally difficult for some men to talk about something so deeply personal. And so I just thought it was an interesting story to get out there.
It certainly is, and your courage in telling it is incredible. Jess, what about for you? You talk about in your quarterly essay, one of the bits that just stayed with me is you were talking about holding the hands of survivors when they inevitably disclose to you at all these events, and this is what happens. I'm sure it's happened to everyone on this stage. When you write about these difficult things, you get these disclosures. But what's the responsibility in us putting these stories out there? The care that we need to take.
Well, I mean, now it's often not just the people that I meet at events like this, but when I was at the Sydney Writers' Festival last weekend, pretty much everybody that I spoke alongside had either their own story or a story of a loved one that had happened quite recently. So, in the green room, it was all disclosures. But I guess that's the thing, the stewardship of the story, not only in the writing, but after it's been published, is something that means a lot to me. Many of the people I wrote about in See What You Made Me Do, I'm still quite close friends and comrades with. We scheme and conspire over how to, overthrow systems, or at least reform them. But one of the things that struck me, I do a lot of judicial education on coercive control, and I speak alongside some incredible people, including Jennifer Coates, who was one of the judicial officers on the Royal Commission into Institutional Child Sexual Abuse. And she said that she was baffled at first why so many survivors would come, not crippled, good, would come after getting securing a conviction for their perpetrator and want to share that story again. Haven't you already received closure and justice? And they were very clear about the fact that justice had not been served, because only the parts of their story that were relevant to the charge were presented to the court. And the Royal Commission was a chance for them to tell their story from beginning to end, in the order in which they felt was most important. And that resonated so much for me, because when I would interview, still now when I interview, but when I interviewed for See What You Made Me Do, it was, from the beginning, exactly what Sonia and Shannon have said. It was with power of veto, but it was also in the spirit of collaboration, and it was to say, you tell me your story from beginning to end. I'm not going to ask questions until the end. And we can talk for as long as you want, over as many sessions as you want. Not a very financially efficient way to write, I've got to say. But in the sense that for so long, the way that we've covered this is if it bleeds, it leads. Yeah. Tell me about the time that he almost ran you down with the car. Let's start with that. And it's like, no, for them, that time was just the tail end of a long and often torturous, and more insidious regime of coercive control. So I think that's really important. And in the See What You Made Me Do, it was very difficult because a couple of the people who were very close allies through the writing of it and whose stories feature prominently were then not very... not happy with the advocacy that I and others did around coercive control laws. And interestingly, actually, so it's not the people that you'd necessarily think. But anyway, and so I had to be really careful. Sometimes we'd have live confrontations, a couple of times on Q&A, which were extremely uncomfortable. But always I just had to steward that relationship. And my first point of, interest was, is this person okay? If I don't get my point of defence across on national television, that doesn't actually matter right now, because this relationship is more important.
It's so interesting what you're saying, and also I'm reflecting as well, and Shannon, you might be thinking about this too. Like, as journalists, we never learn to be trauma-informed. I mean, I've sort of come up with my own technique, and I know you have, but that's not something we get taught as writers, and we should. We really should be. You brought up the justice system, and this is relevant to all your works as well, you know, and the idea of you ask, what does justice actually mean? And this is a really interesting question, because it's usually not in the justice system that people say they get justice. Jess, in your essay calling for an all systems response, Shannon is talking about how many men don't survive long enough to heal. And I mean, these are really big questions, but Sonia, especially after your panel with Quentin McDermott earlier today, I might start with you again. You know, can our court system deliver meaningful justice for people, or is it something else, justice?
I would need about a week to answer that question. That is such a huge question. As you said before, I asked throughout my book, what does justice actually mean? And that is kind of like the thread of my book. And spoiler alert, I don't answer it at the end. But I think, you know, if we're talking about delivering justice, we have to actually know what we're talking about. And I worked out by the end of my experience that, you know, because I was thinking, what am I keep saying I want justice, but what is that thing that I want? And I'd find myself Googling justice, thinking that Google could give me an answer to what I wanted. And I realised that I think when a lot of people say they want justice, you know, we have this tendency to think of an eye for an eye as justice, and that can never be delivered for someone who has experienced sexual violence or domestic violence or a victim of any of these kind of very serious crimes. That thing that was taken will never be given back. So we have to understand that kind of angle on justice is kind of pointless. I think when people say they want justice, what they often mean is they want a safe space where they can heal. And I think that's what I was looking for. I was looking for somewhere where I could heal. And for some people, that will mean when my perpetrator is in jail, I can heal. For some people, it will be when I get accountability, or when I can speak out publicly, or when someone can say, yes, you've been wronged. These are all different ways. Some people just need compensation so they can get on with their life. These are all different ways that people will try, you know, be able to manage their healing. However, we have a justice system that not only doesn't provide a safe space for people to heal, it actually does further damage to them. And so they go there wanting to be heard and to be healed, and they come away just 10 times worse. And so, yes, we need to look at we need to understand that people want different things from justice when they say they want justice, but we also have to recognise that the justice system in its current form it cannot deliver justice on any level, because it is not a safe place for a survivor to be.
Is your book a way of writing your own justice, like rewriting the story to take it back?
Oh, absolutely. It was... I mean, a lot of people have said to me, it must have been really hard to write your book. And my answer has always been, it was fantastic writing my book. I loved it. It was actually the highlight of my day when I could sit and write my book, because it was the time when I could write my story and no one was kind of saying, oh, that can't be used as evidence, or how are you going to prove that? Or I could just say, this happened to me and I am telling you what happened. And so it was a wonderful experience writing it. It was a very difficult experience publishing it, especially getting the legals come and say, you can't say that. And I'd be like, I am saying that. And they'd say, you cannot say that. And I was, you know, arm wrestling, and guess who won? They won, because, you know, my book wouldn't have been published.
Yeah.
So the writing of the book was a really great experience.
I'm so happy. And in case you're wondering if the book, Sonia's book is dark, it's not. It's actually, she walks this beautiful line between her own story and these wider issues. The justice system and what justice means is really important. And I want to talk to both of you. Shannon, some of the men in your book do not survive. And that was one of the hardest things I found, because there's no justice for them now. So how do you look at this idea of justice when you're talking about child victims who are perhaps never heard and don't survive long enough to heal?
I, in the course of writing this book, but also in the 2 years since having conversations with so many men, I'm yet to find a man who's had a positive experience with the justice system, whether it's their interactions with police, whether it's going to the court, whether it's getting an adequate sentence. At no point have they found a space for them that allows them to tell their story and get some kind of outcome. What's most upsetting is that one of the recommendations from the Royal Commission was to run a public awareness campaign to encourage people to come forward and seek help. That was rolled out before the recommendation on funding support services. And so we got a really great television ad telling, survivors, don't suffer in silence, come forward. And then when someone makes the very brave decision to do so, there is nowhere to go. If you're a male adult survivor of child sexual abuse, there are 3 organisations across the country that are dedicated to supporting you. All of them are not-for-profit and run on the smell of an oily rag. One of them, which is the only one that runs group services, in-person group support services, had its funding cut by the last New South Wales government and has just had it restored, thankfully. So this huge and horrible issue that we seem to be taking seriously and caring about, there's kind of nothing below the surface. And that, to me, how can you ever hope to find peace or justice if the basics aren't there and if you can't get help for this huge thing that you're struggling with?
What is that message to you as a survivor of childhood abuse when you look around and there's 3 small organisations for the entire country that, as you say, are funded on the smell of an oily rag, or perhaps not at all, by donations, whatever?
That no one cares.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, there's an element of truth in it. It's not that people don't care about child sexual abuse. Everyone finds it abhorrent, and that it's one of the most horrific things that you can do to somebody. But the truth of the matter is that it is so horrible that when we can, we don't think about it. To think about it, to confront it, is a huge thing that unsettles every part of your day. And so it's easier to not confront it, to not acknowledge it. And that is especially true for politicians. There's no votes to be won in putting millions of dollars into a support service, because chances are breakfast television won't cover that policy announcement because it's too grim. Newspapers won't cover it because it's boring in their eyes.
And it's uncomfortable, right? We have no idea how to talk
to that.
Like if you're saying to someone, I was abused as a child, that's it's
a real dinner party killer. I experienced that. Everyone asking me, what's your second book about?
Yeah.
And so in the end, I just said trauma and left it at that. But it's one of the worst things, and if you can, you won't think about it.
Congratulations to both of you for covering these topics, because they're hard. Jess, this is not necessarily in your latest quarterly essay, but one of the things I found interesting about See What You Made Me Do, and also your earlier writing before the book came out, was we have this assumption until you hit the justice system, you assume it's there and it's going to work for you if you ever need it. And then once you hit it, you realise it's not. It doesn't work, it's misogynist, it's got all these baked-in problems. And the stuff that stayed with me from that earlier work that you've done is about kids that end up with the perpetrator, the sexual abuse perpetrator, because of the expert witnesses in the justice system. So I just wonder if you could, like Sonia, you could probably talk for 2 hours on this non-stop, but can you encapsulate that for us when you realise that how profoundly damaged and damaging those systems within the justice system are, and how broken they are?
Sure. I mean, so going into family court and investigating that was literally like going through the looking glass, and I actually called the chapter in the book exactly that. It was sort of like being initiated into this upside-down world where everyone, like if you report to police and you have, well, let's just presume good responses here when I say these things. You report to police and police say like, oh, you're in domestic violence. We need to see if we can get a domestic violence order for you. You report to child protection and child protection are like, what are you doing to protect your kids from this violent man? If you're not protecting them well enough, we might just have to take them away from you. And then you go to family court, same relationship, and family court says, what are you doing to facilitate a relationship between your children and this man? And if you don't facilitate a relationship with your children and this man, then we might have to take them away from you. And this is the three planets that Marianne Hester talks about, that domestic violence survivors, they live on all at once. They're jumping from one planet to the next and trying to meet the requirements of each planet. And if they don't meet the requirements of two planets, child removal is the threat. Now, in family court, what I looked at, and honestly, I think, when I talk about the stories that you hold carriage of, the interpersonal violence, I would say, probably makes up about 30% of that story, and then the rest of it is the violence that's done by systems or the institutional betrayal. What I looked at with the family court, one of the first stories I did on it, was finding out that there were these expert report writers they would be brought on to assess the family, the children, the two parents, and write a report for the family court. One of the sort of leading experts in this area called them the gods of the family court, because that report would have more bearing than what police, what child protection, what the psychologists of the children would say. It was the most weighty piece of evidence. And what we were finding was that there were these single experts who would assess the family for about an hour, each time. They would be making surmisals like, we think that this woman has borderline personality disorder, for example. We think that she should have her children removed. Now, maybe, there were sometimes those assessments may have been close to the bone. Point being, how could they make that assessment in an hour? But what we found out is that family lawyers who represent alleged perpetrators know exactly which expert report writers to go to, and for $20,000 they'll write the report that you want. And I have a list of about 15 names of these expert report writers that I've heard come up again and again and again. Because they have witness immunity, I can't put those cases together and say there are 20 cases of children who were sent to live with the perpetrator they had disclosed against, often sexual abuse, who were either handed into the full-time custody of and the mother absolutely prohibited from seeing that child, or given overnight care to. I can tell you which experts facilitated those, except I'm not allowed to, except for the expert that I interviewed, who obviously had enough hubris to want to go on tape.
And was very angry though, really
yes.
defensive.
Oh, and threatened to sue when he knew I was going to publish it again in the book. Fortunately, he'd actually said it on tape, and I said, well, read the transcript. But he said 90% of the cases that came before him of child sexual abuse allegations made by the children, he found to be unfounded.
So this is interesting. We're talking about the justice system, but there's a through line in all of your books where different segments of the community are failing us. Like there's a lack of teachers or adults, or there's a lack of, the courts are broken, or there's colleagues, there's parents, there's people around us when these things are happening. So I wonder if you can each tell me what you think a community looks like that protects victims from violence, or at least intervenes. There's so many intervention points that pass by. Sonia?
That's a big question.
Well, take your case,
okay.
though. There was lots of intervention points where adults could have helped you and they didn't.
Yes, but I'm going to actually just start by coming back to how you started today's session and talking about that we, live on land which was established as the country of Australia
through murder,
through violence, and I think we have to acknowledge that violence actually seeps through all of our institutions, and that abuse of power seeps through all of our institutions. And I think that while we can we teach children from a very, very early age to defer to their parents, and children will do that naturally. And throughout their, as a kid in a classroom, if you're told to pick up a piece of paper, you pick up the piece of paper, you don't say, that's not my piece of paper. And that happens throughout life. And then it continues on, through institution as well. We are in the grips of a kind of a culture of kind of abuse of power, where if you're in a workplace and you see any kind of abuse taking place, for a lot of people, their first question isn't, what can I do here? It is, what does the person in power, how am I going to keep my job? And what's the best thing for me to do in order to stay safe? Not how can I look after that person? So I think we're looking at kind of violence that is so embedded, and it's like a form of coercive control in our workplaces and in the country.
Sonia and I had a really interesting conversation at one point about how all pop music is grooming us. And if you start listening to the lyrics of songs, you almost can't listen, because it's all about, get into my car, older men. It's really, once you start looking for where is there violence, it's everywhere.
Yeah, and so, we have talked also a lot about how violence, isn't always physical. There is coercion, there's threat of, bad things happening. So we're looking at violence on so many levels, which is so embedded in our culture that I think it's hard to actually talk about what a caring society might look like, because it's just so entrenched.
And unreconciled with.
Absolutely, yeah.
We've sort of zoomed out.
That was very dismal, wasn't it?
We've zoomed out, but let's zoom into your story for a second, because what was amazing reading your book is I was thinking, surely at some point some adult is going to intervene in this, and it never happened.
No.
So there's all these people watching the sort of normalisation of
abuse
of a very young girl by a 26-year-old man, and no one, maybe because of pop music, it was all normalised, no one's stepped in.
Yeah, and I think it's because we don't recognise what violence is, and I think as a society we don't understand grooming, and we don't understand coercive control. We don't understand what it looks like, and I didn't understand what it looked like, and it took me 35 years to actually recognise that I'd been abused. And I argued with my therapist when she said, you have been abused, and I said, no, I wasn't abused. I was in a loving relationship. And she just kind of shook her head, here's me, PhD, parents who are psychiatrists and stuff, and I'm trying to justify the abuse as love. I said I was in love. And then later on, at a different therapist, there have been many, she told me I'd been groomed, and I said, no, I hadn't. I wasn't groomed. I was in love with this guy. So I think we don't understand what violence is. We have normalised these things, and I don't hold it against the people who just watched on from the sidelines while I was groomed and abused, because they didn't see it, I didn't see it. I was a child, the adults should have seen it. But, even when I went to the police several years ago, friends of mine, a couple of friends said, why are you doing this to him? Why, he was your boyfriend. Why are you ruining his life? So they still didn't understand that what I had been through was abuse.
It's interesting, isn't it? And this happens in your work as well. The victim is blamed for wrecking someone's life. We get this all the time. He was such a good guy,
Yes.
Shannon, I just want to bring you in, because that's a very similar response you had to your therapist, and you kept wanting him to tell you hadn't been abused. You're like, this isn't abuse. He said this wasn't, and he never answered you. So I wonder if you could just pick up on what Sonia's saying and kind of talk about that denying of the violence that happened to you, because once you look it in the eye, you have to do something about it.
That's right. And for me, it was self-preservation. I didn't want to accept that, because then I knew I was opening a door to something pretty heavy, and I would have to walk through it. And it is a big thing to sit with. So yeah, that's very similar experience. And this is after years of therapy where I thought I was so enlightened and I knew everything about myself, and then it was this off-the-cuff comment about, oh, well, this is a common thing with someone who's been abused, and looking around like there was someone else in the room.
But what was it in you that kind of wanted him to almost say, no, you're fine, that didn't happen, you haven't been abused? And even in the introduction to your book, you say, I don't even know if this is abuse because it was another child doing it to you.
Yes, and it's a real grey area, to put it that bluntly, in the child abuse space. They call it peer-on-peer abuse. There are some experts that don't even know how to deal with it. Is it a criminal act? Is it, at what point does it become something really sinister? And there's no concrete answer. But it's about 30% of child sexual abuse cases are perpetrated by another child. So it's a really serious issue. It's something teachers are grappling with to a shocking extent in schools. That tends to be where it starts or where it plays out. For me, it was, I didn't want to confront that. It felt far too big. And everything I saw about child sexual abuse and knew about child sexual abuse felt insurmountable for those who've experienced it, whether it's the justice system, whether it's trying to find help and failing, whether it's the taboo and the stigma surrounding it. It was just easier for me not to think about myself that way. But then, of course, once I opened the door, and and even the process of writing the book. From the start of the book, I say, I don't think this was abuse, and then by the end of it, it's like, oh yeah, it was. Yeah. he was older. There was a power imbalance. It was very sort of deliberate and premeditated. It's an interesting process.
I mean, that's a wonderful thing about actually writing something so long, is that you're kind of learning as you go, and it changes you throughout the process. Jess, what about you? You have been looking at all these systems, these broken systems, for a long time. What if you had a magic wand and you could paint this society of a community, a society that keeps us safe, that protects us from violence and intervenes when violence occurs? What would it look like? What's the stuff you would change?
First of all, it would come from this perspective of attachment theory, and that one doesn't just rip one's child away without very good reason, and that the first priority of our society should be trying to heal those relationships if that is at all possible. So that would totally change the way that the child protection system worked. It would completely differently inform the way the family court system works. And I think that if you're thinking about communities of care, one thing that happens, and I'm sure it's happened to both of you, is that when you write about this stuff, first of all, members of your family start coming out of the woodwork and start telling you about their experiences. But then as you go on, as the years go on, you start having friends who are going through these experiences, and they're turning to you as their first port of call, because often they don't feel like anybody else will likely understand or sit with them for long enough. And my sense is that a community of care educates itself on what coercive control and grooming looks like, so that they can better identify it when it will happen to someone they know, because it's not if, I think, given the stats, 1 in 4 women. So when you are confronted with that in your circle with someone you are close to, leaning into that and then staying with that person, helping them war game out what to do, because sometimes it is like playing 4D chess when you're helping a victim survivor trying to outwit someone who is literally intent on destroying their life, and who has degraded them to such a point that they don't trust their own mind anymore. Sometimes it's for someone who's in that relationship who won't or can't leave for any number of reasons. It's just staying in contact, even when that person doesn't want to stay in contact, really just like trying to stay in the zone and being that person who's always reflecting back the best parts of themselves, reminding them who they are as that part of themselves is slowly being stripped away. But I think also on the basis of what Sonia was saying before about people didn't notice, people didn't know what grooming looked like. The problem is we also don't believe children. Yeah. So children, and this is a thing, like this is, the surveys have shown like almost half or more percent of the 50% of the population, their first instinct is not to believe a child when they say something that's happened to them, particularly if it's happened from a parent. And there's this idea, and this was also with that single expert, I might say, he said on tape, children live in a fantasy world.
But Professor Mike Salter, who you all know, has shown that children don't actually lie. They don't make it up.
No, they live in a fantasy world. Like my kid, I don't want to bust open her fantasy world because she'll kill me. But anyway, she has a very special magic world that she and her friends occupy at school, which I cannot reveal the details of under threat of death. But but she also knows and told us about things that happened with another child when she was only just barely verbal. Kids know when something they experience crosses that line and becomes threatening, and they know how to verbalise that. And to be honest, a lot of kids will verbalise that time and time again to people that they trust, and when those people who they trust don't do anything with that, they go into a deep silence, and they may stay in that deep silence for decades, as you both know.
And, I mean, Shannon, with your story, like as someone who's reported on trauma, I was looking at the red flags one after the other, like a child that's bedwetting, a child that is having traumatic dreams, like on and on and on. Like, really, I guess if the adults around you knew what those signs were, they would have seen it. But also maybe they weren't looking.
No.
That's right, yeah.
I mean, Shannon, I'll come to you first, and then Sonia, you can comment.
And also, if I had been asked point blank what's going on, what had happened, I don't think I would have said anything because I didn't know how to verbalise it. I was terrified of getting in trouble or being thought of as broken or whatever. And that's one of the biggest learnings from the book, from speaking to the experts when I asked them the impossible question of how do we stop this. There are so many things we could do right now if we had endless amounts of money and a magic wand. But one of the biggest things I think that would turn the dial back down is empowering kids to know about their bodies, about what's appropriate and what's not, about feeling safe to speak up if, God forbid, something happens to them. And having the language, because that is the most powerful thing. Kids know what's right and wrong, even if they don't understand why. And Michael Salter says this, that kids will play doctor and nurse, and sometimes, a parent would balk, but that's just normal kid stuff. But a child that feels shame doesn't understand why they feel shame, but that is the sign that something has gone wrong, that it's gone further than Dr. Nurse, show me mine, I'll show you yours. So kids can tell when something is wrong. They just need to know why or how to tell someone that it's wrong. And the reason why is that, this image that we have in our head of the boogeyman or some monster in the darkness who comes and does something horrible to our children doesn't exist. It's a lie. I grew up as a child of the 80s with the Safety House program where you were taught to look for a house with a little yellow house, and if you see a dodgy white panel van, run in there and you'll be fine. 9 out of 10 perpetrators of child sexual abuse are known to the child. It's an uncle, it's a neighbour, a sports coach, a music teacher, sometimes a direct family member. How do you cope with that? It's not a monster, it's a person you already know.
But the language is important. And, I think we'll get to hope in a second because I don't want to end with everyone feeling miserable. But that is a hopeful thing. Like my daughter's 14 and some guy was harassing her on social media and she hit right back with, you're a misogynist so-and-so, that's not on. And she was using this language and that did make me feel hopeful because she had the language. She understood what it was. So I'm hoping, there's a generational change. Sonia, when I said just before no one was looking or perhaps they deliberately weren't looking, your eyes kind of lit up. What did you want to say?
Okay, well, I can't remember, but because it was more than a split second ago. Even if it was a split second ago, I probably wouldn't remember.
I feel you, Sonia.
But there's also this tricky area in that people did see what was happening to me, but they didn't intervene because I wanted to be there, and I did want to be there. And this is a really difficult area of sex ed, and obviously growing up when I did, sex ed was like STDs and pregnancy, and that was it. But today it's groundbreaking that kids are being taught about consent, but it's not the whole story. Consent is not enough, because if someone had said to me, had taught me about consent, I'd be fine. I would have said, back then when I was being abused, I would have said, yeah, all good, I consent. I was willingly going every weekend to take loads of drugs and drink lots of alcohol and be abused. So consent education, as incredible as it is, wouldn't have helped me. I think the things that would have helped me would have been education around power and how power can warp consent, and that especially as a child, you want to be loved. And if you are not getting what you need at home, which I came from domestic violence, and I talk about the thread in my book. I was not getting what I needed at home, and there was someone who was giving me exactly what I needed. He was telling me I was beautiful, I was gorgeous, I just want to be with you all the time. He was telling me, it was just music to my ears. It was just like, oh my God, how lucky am I to have this man in my life. I will do anything for you. And in my diary, there's, I will die for this man. This man who was abusing me, I would have died for him. And I would have protected him. If anyone had tried to intervene, I would have said, hands off.
But he did a good job of grooming you.
Brilliant.
He'd actually,
absolutely. And so people need to understand that grooming is very tricky. It's, you can't just say, are you being abused? Because I would have said, absolutely not. I love this guy.
Yeah. So you've just brought me into the exact thing I want to talk about next. If you've got questions, start forming them in your mind, because we're going to come to them. I've just got 2 more questions. Well, I've got about 5,000, but I can only fit 2 more in. What assumptions and narratives do we need to disrupt? Because you all talk about this in different ways in your work. Shannon, what needs disrupting when it comes to childhood abuse, but also male childhood abuse?
Probably the biggest one is that it's uncommon and that it's really uncomfortable to confront, but 2 in 5 children will be sexually abused, and that's a horrific number to think about. You think about how many kids you know, and it tends to be more than 5, and by the power of statistics, that's a really horrible thing. I think if we accept that it is common, it's shockingly common, then we'll be more willing to confront the gravity of the issue and push for change, because there are some really simple things that could change. For example, not allowing someone convicted of child sexual abuse to introduce good character references at their sentencing and get a discounted sentence because someone thinks they're a good bloke.
Yeah.
That's ridiculous.
And we've got this narrative, right? When guys murder their wives, he's a good bloke.
Yeah, who cares?
He's not.
It's baffling to me. He's not. But he plays footy at the weekend with teenagers, and it's madness. But the more pressure there is, the more willingness there'll be from those in power to consider change. But I think that starts with accepting that this is not a fringe issue, that it happens far too often, and that it's not getting any better. In fact, in some data, it's getting worse, despite us being open to it and spending money here and there, having God knows how many royal commissions or commissions of inquiry, all of which have produced really great recommendations for change, barely any of which have been implemented.
And Jess, you're looking in depth at the National Plan to End Violence, and you've got some really strong research and ideas about narratives that we think work, ways that we think we're going to solve this, which perhaps don't. So what narratives need to be disrupted in your view?
Well, just building, there's many. And I wrote the longest quarterly essay ever written because there are so many that need to be disrupted. But building on what you both have said, the idea that education will fix everything, that is just an Australian disease. And we know, for example, exactly what Sonia's saying, consent education. If you're under 16, consent is a moot point, for starters. Obviously, consent education, great for the future as you're going into those older relationships. An unpopular position that I have in the quarterly, but evidenced, is that I believe respectful relationships education and consent education will definitely do two things. One, it will increase the rate of disclosure among students, which currently schools do not know how to respond to. Two, it will probably destigmatise to a certain extent the experience of that, and then make the impact of that abuse lesser. I do not think, based on the evidence that we have, internationally and nationally, that we will reduce sexual violence through respectful relationships education in schools. And I say that because this generation, and this is not the only piece of evidence, but the Australian Child Maltreatment Study showed that 16 to 24-year-olds, they are the first generation to be more likely to be sexually offended against by an adolescent than an adult. And in intimate partner relationships, sexual offending by adolescents have doubled within a generation. Now, what's happened within that generation? A number of things: social media, online porn. And we hear people saying, when the government does what I think is a pretty brave thing and say, we're going to put age verification on porn, and we're actually going to put a social media ban for under 16-year-olds, because actually 30% of young people access porn through social media. Social media, like porn, is all over Twitter and all the rest of it, and Instagram. When that gets put on the table, you hear from the sector, including, saying, well, kids just need context. You just need to educate kids about porn. Well, what about the porn that they're watching compulsively that talks about stepsisters and stepmothers and the so-called, incest porn, basically, in the normalising.
It's normalising kind of adult sex with children all the time.
It's
the sort of
fetishising
stepmother goes in and, essentially rapes the 12-year-old stepson.
You don't absolutely. Let's have education on that for the kids that go through. And people are saying, but they'll use VPNs. You know what? A third of these kids are stumbling upon it accidentally. And they're seeing it because porn companies know they even know the accidental keystrokes that young kids are going to put in when they put Google searches in. So, if we're just going to stop them accidentally stumbling upon it, if you've got, a few kids who are using VPNs because they're so desperate to watch porn, okay, sure, I don't think that's going to be the massive problem that we have right now. It's like, we don't sell beer in the school canteen. Why are we okay with under 18-year-olds watching porn? And with it also being positioned some people need that as sex education. What kind of sex education is it when mainstream porn has so much violence, casual violence, racism, heavy-duty misogyny, and they're expanding the sexual vocabulary of young people to the point where sexual violence services are now seeing anal rape and strangulation on a regular basis, when the head of the Gold Coast Sexual Assault Centre said back in 1990, when she first started, she can remember maybe 4 reports from the entire year. And now they just get those reports every day. And the harmful sexual behaviours are starting not when the kids are 10 or 12, and they're often, kids who've been removed from families and have clear backgrounds of trauma. They're starting in daycare, and the original trauma is that they've watched hardcore porn. And there are counsellors having to use EMDR processing to help children get over what they've seen.
And if I can just bring in my cyber hate expertise in here, Jonathan Haidt, who wrote The Anxious Generation, has just done all of this exploration about Snapchat, and it's very clear that these platforms are deliberately letting predators use them. So
they monetise it. They monetise abuse.
It suits their revenue model.
There's a reason that no one who works for these social media platforms or invented them lets their children use them.
Yes.
They are so open about it. There's a reason.
Like the Snapchat CEO.
And the pressure of parents, I'm going through this right now, of saying you cannot be on Snapchat. All my friends have it. That's all. And so the pressure that's coming to bear on kids, it's very hard to go against the grain. Now, listen, we're going to come to questions in a second. This is my last one. All of your books, despite your essay, but your books, despite the challenging nature of what's in them, they have these really powerful elements of hope in there and really powerful hope for change. So what is that hope for you?
Thank you. I think it's very hopeful. You know, being here today for me is a tremendously kind of hopeful moment, because I know 10 years ago I wouldn't have been sitting here in a loud shirt talking about being groomed. So I think we have come a long way, and so that makes me very hopeful. I think there are a lot of people, I loved both of these people's works, absolutely. I've got so much admiration for them, and one of the things I loved about Jess's quarterly essay is talking about looking at the whole picture of the thread of where the trauma starts, not just kind of addressing the immediate sort of where we are now, this critical situation, but looking at, you know, why perpetrators are the way they are, and that's not justifying what they do, but that is just saying, okay, we've got traumatised people who are using violence as a language because they don't have another language, they don't have the skills to emotionally regulate. And I'm finding more and more people sort of, I talk about that also in my book, and I feel like there's a lot of, because I realised that what I actually needed, the one thing that would have helped me wasn't education, it was my family needed support. My mum needed support so that she could properly be the attachment figure that I needed, because my family had been kind of destroyed, she'd been kind of destroyed, I went looking for a family elsewhere, and our family needed help at that time and we weren't given it, and so I just went looking for help elsewhere. And I think looking at that kind of lower, you know, that early intervention where we don't just go problem, just throw some money at solutions. We need to kind of go, what is going to help support families be the best that they can? Whatever that family looks like, how can we support parents? These are parents and children with a lot of trauma and they need our support.
Community.
And there's more people doing that and talking about that. So that makes me hopeful.
Shannon, where do you find hope?
I think in my book, which you should all buy.
You should buy it.
But I found it in my book. You know, they're really heavy stories, and there's a lot of tragedy in them. But all of the men that I spoke to have, in some way, found a semblance of peace, or they've found, you know, their place in the world and their context. And it's by talking to people, by seeking help. Even reading other books and feeling like they're not alone. So that gives me a lot of hope that no matter what's happened to you, it's not impossible to find, you know, peace of in some way. And many of these men are now giving back. They're volunteering at support groups. One of the men in the book has gone on to launch a campaign against character references in sentencing for men or for anyone convicted of child sexual abuse. They've found a purpose in using what's happened to them to try and make something good in the world, and that gives me a great deal of hope.
Okay, Jess, we're very short on time,
I'll be
but
very
tell me
quick.
where you find hope.
Well, I find hope and need hubris, basically, to feel like by pure force of will from all of us, we're going to be able to change otherwise immovable systems. But also, we do see actually times when things work. And I'd say that Royal Commission into Institutional Child Sex Abuse, you look at the Australian Child Maltreatment Study and the rate of child sex abuse within institutions, since that Royal Commission was held, it has plummeted. So accountability and consequences and learning what that looks like, it has worked. And I think there's a lot to learn from that.
And also just that we, like you said, are having this conversation and everybody here in the room is wanting to engage in this hard stuff. So thank you all for being here. Now, we are just going to go to a couple of questions. We're very short on time because we are all chatterboxes. But if you're going to ask a question, please do not disclose. There are lots of survivors in this room, so we don't want anyone triggered. Please start your question with who, what, why, when, or how, and make it short. Who's got a question? Oh, can I give you my microphone? Oh, hi, guys.
Hi. As As a storyteller, I am endlessly inspired by all four of you. I've read all of your books. And I would love to hear your thoughts on this question, which is, given the power that stories have to change political, sociocultural, emotional landscapes, and also has potentially the power to misrepresent lived experience and bend facts, is there anything that you would like to see writers of fiction, especially crime fiction, or writers of TV shows that are dealing with these kind of subjects? Is there anything that you would like to see done differently, more of, less of, whatever, going forward?
Who wants to take that? Sonia?
Sure. Thank you. Great question, and it's very similar to a question I asked this morning of Quentin McDermott, who wrote the book on Kathleen Folbig, and I asked him about the role of storytellers and the media with these kinds of cases. I think really something, and this is another thing that is making me very hopeful, I think always listening to survivors is probably the number one thing, and that's something that Jess does in her work, and that's something that Shannon and I are both doing. We're both survivors who are speaking out, and people are listening to me. And I'm really pleased to say that I've met with Katie Gallagher's office. I'm meeting with Jason Clare's office next week. People are listening. I've been in touch with Bravehearts. People are beginning to listen to survivors, and they want to hear their stories. And I think if you listen to survivors, then they will let you know if you're on the money or not.
Do either of you want to say anything about that?
I agree totally. And when it comes to fiction or art, television shows and films, that's a really powerful way of getting important issues across. I know a couple of people in the space that make television or film dramas, and survivors are part of that process. They're in the writer's room sharing their perspective. And it's important because it means that the story is told from a survivor's perspective, but it also produces art that's authentic. And I think audiences, regardless of their knowledge of the topic, can feel authenticity. And it's important that those stories are grounded in a truth.
Can I just jump in and just say one little thing that I think needs to be added, and that is that there is also a lot of diversity in experience of survivors. And obviously, if you're white, middle class, educated, you're more likely to have had your story told and platformed and listened to, and it's really important to look for people who might not have the ability to platform their stories, because their stories are just as important.
Okay, we might... One more question. Just for the recording, because it's a little bit hard. So we've got a teacher who had an abuse situation in the class, and it was very difficult to deal with and not really resourced. Yeah, so there was a lack of separation room at the school. Jess, you look like you wanted to respond to that.
Oh, yeah, look, it's a big bugbear of mine, and I'm so sorry that you, obviously a very caring and genuine teacher, have left that profession because of that experience. Because we're seeing at the moment in Victoria 6 child-on-child sexual assaults being reported every week in primary schools. We don't have, at the moment, a national code that would tell teachers, if this happens, this is best practice response. And to leave it up to individual teachers to have to work it out on the spot and not have any understanding or training when this is becoming more common, when we're about to roll out respectful relationships education nationwide, which will bring on more disclosures, which will surface all of this. I think that it's an abject neglect by government. At the moment, there's a review into bullying and into developing a bullying code. I'm calling everyone I know on that review to say you've got to bring in peer-on-peer sexual assault and tech-based sexual, abuse, image-based sexual abuse, because if we let this opportunity go, it will be years before we're able to develop that sort of mandatory response. And what happens is the teachers bear the burden, but also the child who is victimised bears the burden, and often they end up leaving the school or interrupting their studies for a long period of time as a result. And that's just, I don't think that's acceptable. If we're going to be teaching kids about how to have respectful relationships, expecting them to disclose, we need to have that response ready, as Shannon said.
And it's not there. And it's just yet another massive thing dumped on the shoulders of teachers who are sort of, given this burden of dealing with this really big thing, but without any of the resources of responding to it. I mean, I think there's a real reason why teachers are leaving the industry at such a rapid rate. It's horrible.
Can I rant just for 10 seconds?
Go.
I just
Quickly.
So I think part of this problem is that we have envisioned school education as stopping it at the start. We are not at the start of a river where people are standing on dry land before sexual abuse or before domestic violence has happened. We have 4 in 10 children growing up with domestic abuse. We have enormous numbers of children who are experiencing sexual abuse in childhood from other children. We are not in a before space, we are in a during space, and the education that happens in schools is both primary prevention, it's both trying to stop it before it starts, it is also secondary prevention, which is responding once it has already happened. And I think that we need to expand this idea of what this education is for and what the impact it is that we'll have.
Right. Thank you so much to all of you for coming. Please thank my courageous panel, Sonia Orchard, Jess Hill, Shannon Molloy, and thank you all for coming and listening.